First of all, I'm a writer, and I study language. When I read his fiction, first of all, I'm amazed at the structure. And I think to myself, well, where does this influence come from? So today I was rereading Thomas Pynchon, and I recognized that there are these similarities in the complexity of the sentences or comes up with. I'm going to read you one. I say this out of envy because I can't write sentences. I try. This is one sentence, by the way. Now, I didn't count how many words this is, but it's probably, well, half a page. He found himself in literature courses he never had imagined, exploring the intellectual ideas of the 19th century, how thinkers like Darwin, Marx, and Freud tried to solve the problems of the present and design a better future by understanding the past or overcoming its horrors. And he, riding on the subway back to 34th Street, walking a block to his residence at Sloane House, unable to calm his head, bubbling with ideas, and so he leaves his small room and walks back into the street to a revival house to watch all three parts of The Godfather in sequence, one after the other, until he could watch no more. Now, I assume that really happened, right? That's one sentence. I just want to point that out because another thing that strikes me is the difference between Anouar as a fiction writer and as a scholar. And he says in The Second Chance, which is the book I love and as well kind of envy, to me it's Lord, when I think of the two novels, it's as if Thomas Pynchon wrote a memoir, which he never has. But in reading his fiction, I asked myself, well, how has he taken his intellectual pursuits that he's wrestled with over the decades and filtered them through fiction? Now, he says in Second Chance that actually fiction is much more difficult to write. He says it's child's play to write scholarly essays and books in comparison to fiction, and fiction takes him to a different place than scholarship does, according to him. And it takes him to a place that you cannot really plan or plot. You can't just sit in the library and expect the inspiration to come to you the way a fiction writer really needs to happen. So I want to raise a few questions that hopefully we can discuss in the panel. If you look at the two novels as autobiographical, which I write biographies, and I rarely read a biography, certainly I've never written one, that tries to tell a personal story through fiction the way these two books do. And so I look at them as sort of the bookmarks of a career. Beginning of his career, the protagonist hasn't yet arrived in America. He's sitting in a cafe in Tangier, reflecting on his life, but asking questions of a mentor. The second book, decades later, the same protagonist returns to Tangier, sits in the same cafe, and speaks to a younger man who wants to go to America and have an academic career. So what happens in these decades? So on the one hand, there is a biography of his experiences over the decades. But as I read them, it's also sort of a biography of multiple things. One, the cafe, and secondly, Tangier. Third, it's a biography of America, what's happened in the last, 30 years between the two books. And finally, Dr. Majid, how he's changed over the time. So I think to myself, and again, this is something I like to discuss, of these four subjects, which has changed the least? And I think, obviously, it's the cafe, right? Because the cafe is still the same cafe, the television is different, the juicing machine is no longer there, but essentially it's the same place. In fact, I've met students there, and Dr. Majid has met my students and lectured to them, or discussed, had conversations with them in the cafe, because it hasn't changed very much. And it's a very interesting perch from which to see the world and to look at the changes in the world. So if the cafe hasn't changed very much, according to The Second Chance, Tangier has. It's gone from a relatively small town with a stable population 50 years ago, to a city, like a city of 1 million people, right? A cosmopolitan city. But in the second book, the message rings true that in some ways the city hasn't changed. It's still the only place he feels whole, the only place he feels like he can be fully human and fully Anouar. It hasn't lost its spirit.
Now, let's move on to the United States. According to this book, well, the first novel, Doc is looking forward to the United States, hasn't been there yet. The second novel, he's back in Tangier.
And he looks back at America with a broken heart, I think. He looks at a society that has profoundly changed over time, that has some way lost its way in a manner that Tangier hasn't, and certainly the cafe hasn't. And it's something you can tell us more about. What has actually changed in America, and why is your heart so broken when you think about this country that you fell in love with, really fell in love with? It's literature, it's film, it's culture, it's people, right? And he says in one comment in the book that it now makes him feel as shrunk as a raisin. So, moving on to the last subject, how has he changed over this time? As an intellectual, as a writer, as a human being, as a Yawi, as an American? And I don't know. One thing is certain in the book. You read carefully both of them, as memoirs. There's a certain pursuit that... Is it dead? Okay. There's a certain pursuit that has driven him from the very beginning, I think. And he mentions in the first book, and he mentions in some of his blogs, and in the second novel, the image of Hercules. In C. Yusuf, he meets for 12 days, like Hercules. And in the second novel, he mentions this dream of being like Hercules, bringing the continents together, bringing America together with Moroccan culture, being that kind of link that doesn't exist. It's never existed in the United States, a cultural link, a deep cultural link between the two, kind of link that he wants to forge. And so that was his dream. And at a certain point, he realizes that this hasn't worked in many ways, at least in the book. I think in real life it has worked in many ways. This is an example of it, because this leads me to my last point. I think where he has remained constant is this love, this desire, this sort of visceral lust for conversation, for dialogue, for getting to the truth underneath all the layers of artifice. And that, I think, has led him to create this, to create the kind of dialogue that he has through the Center for Global Humanities in Maine, this campus, and what drives him forward and keeps him writing and keeps him vital. We talked about this yesterday. The only word I can really sum up that captures what drives him is a sense of love for his culture, his civilization, and for what it has to contribute to the world outside of Tangier. So I celebrate him and your work, and I hope.
Well, Khalil, first, thank you for giving us a chance. We really appreciate it. Before I met Anouar, I read him. And technology, okay. Where can you take care of this? Just put it on mute or something. I read him, and I read his first work. I don't know if it's his first work, but one of the most wonderful studies I have actually read about the Moors, because I myself worked in Moors for my PhD thesis, and I had a chance to meet Anouar few years after 2011 when he started working on this project. And we met in Rabat. And I don't know if you remember this, Anouar, because I lost weight and lost hair. And we met at a mall in Hay Riyad in Rabat. And he was actually shopping for shoes. And I couldn't understand that someone was coming from America, the land of malls, and looking for a pair of hush puppies in an obscure mall in North Africa. I just discovered that he was, like me, a shoe fetish. And so we started actually speaking about shoes, and we spoke about Cinderella shoe. And we spoke about Pip shoes from Dickens' Great Expectations. And all of a sudden we started speaking about the shoe that was hurled at George W. Bush in Iraq. So we had a very, very convivial conversation because he was working on this project, and we were talking about this in the presence of, I think, the vice chancellor back then, who was a woman, I can't remember the name. One of my colleagues, a couple of years later, invited me over to speak at the University, and I was there because she said, like, you worked on wars, he worked on wars. I think you share something, why don't you moderate it? The event could not take place because there was a strike on campus. I don't know if you remember that. So we managed to meet some of the people from the top management, but that was about it. But anyway, I was giving this book about a couple of weeks ago, Second Chances, Tangiers. And to be honest with you, it's one of those books that when you start reading it, you can't put it away. And my wife could not understand that how come that I'm 62 and still reading at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I said, this book speaks to me in many ways. And it spoke to me because I lived in America for several years. That's where I did my graduate education, not in New York, in Boston. And at the time I was living in Boston, a friend of mine wrote a book called Un Marocain à New York, Yousef Amin Lalami, a great book. And I circulated among the people who could read it. And I remember someone told me, he was actually a head waiter at a restaurant, impeccable French. He read it and he told me, I wish somebody could write about me. To be honest with you, we had to wait for about 30 years before someone could write about how does it feel to be Moroccan and Muslim and African and black in America. Now, I'm going to sound a little bit academic, if you don't mind. I read the book, and I think that I would share with you probably 3 or 4 qualifications. The first qualification is that this is a book that is epic, but not in an Aristotelian sense. It's an epic in a Brechtian sense, because it comes in chapters, and each chapter stands as a tableau in itself. The book is also very lyrical. The language is just beautiful. I'm actually, as Morad knows, I'm writing now fiction, and I wish I could really pull my finger out to produce the kind of writing that Anouar has actually produced. It's so beautiful, and I say lyrical. And we need books like these in an age where things fall apart, or are falling apart. As Gayatri Spivak used to say, we need aesthetics in the age of globalization, because aesthetics is the mental health care that we can actually provide to keep the world enjoying a fair degree of sanity. The book is also very cyclical, and I felt that there is something quite Sufi about it, and I felt that what comes around goes around, and it's a cycle indeed. It begins with the Café Samara and ends up with the old world. But what happens in between, and personally, I was really, really devastated by what happened to Aziz. But I'm thinking here of two names. I'm thinking about Lamine, for me, who is the safe guardian of Tangiers. But Lamine is trusted with this task that is Herculean, as you said, and he's trying to actually make 3 continents connect. But he's kind of standing on this sort of plate, and I'm going to use a title of a song from the Rolling Stones. It's a continental drift. And by the way, if you listen to the song, it's actually inspired by Jajuka, not too far from here. So it is actually very cyclical, and I feel that it's almost as if Amin was some sort of a whirling dervish. That's how I see it. However, as I said earlier, the book is Brechtian, but it does have an Aristotelian aspect to it, because for me, the climax of the book, if you ask me, there are 2 actually events, that really shook me personally. And it's the chapter about blood of nations. I mean, I'm a father, and I really related to it in a very, very emotionally intense way. And the death of Aziz. And so when I said Lamine is the guardian of Tangiers, and somebody who's trying to keep an eye, very much like Alizawa in Alizawa, keeping an eye on Casablanca, حَتَّى عَيْنِي الْمدينة, as he says, right? I think Lamine is also حَتَّى عَيْنُ عَلَى طنجة, right? And making sure that, because Tangiers, by the way, is a mythical city. And, you know, I have a brother-in-law from Tangiers. You can't stop him when he starts talking about Tangiers, you know, because it is so mythical, in my judgment. Lamine is a trustee, by the way. Lamine is a safe guardian. Lamine is the guardian of the temple, right? But Lamine is somebody who comes home. So in many ways, this book is very, very conciliatory, because despite all the upheavals, you know, that Lamine has witnessed across his journey from the 80s when he moved to study in America, all the way to the present when he has left a wife and a son behind, Lamine keeps seeing significant in this world. That is very, very optimistic when you read it, the book. And this brings me to my last point, because I understand that this book is also a showcase in mutable and fragmented identities. I think what keeps us together are the hyphens, and the hyphens keep us going. And as I say in French, on est tous dans une logique de composition. We're trying to make something, but that something is not really what we are. I worked on the Moors, very much like Anouar, and I chased the identity of Othello. And I can tell you that the pursuit of the identity of Othello is endless and pointless, because you could place him anywhere from Mexico across Mauritania, Tingis, and Caesar, and all the way to the Middle East, and all the way to Indonesia. So I see in the younger man, his name is Rafiq, companion. I see in him a global citizen who has learned from somebody who has gone global and decided to be local. And I just want to mention one last point, and I will give the floor to the next panelist. I think, Anthony, you mentioned how beautiful Anouar writes. I want to share with you something. I think I know my Shakespeare inside out, and I can tell you that the best speakers of English in Shakespeare are not English. They are Othello and Caliban. And for me, as I see it, because I write in foreign language, I write in English, and I came to the conclusion that a native tongue is by definition a foreign tongue. And I can see your alienation. I think you are a native speaker of English, but you said it, you were impressed by how Anouar could write in the style of Pynchon. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. So inspiring, the way you talk about the book, and also the metaphor of, Othello. I believe that I totally agree that, it's useless to trace the origins of Othello, but definitely he belongs to the global south, I would call it. Maybe the other case, Iago. Iago maybe is something like, the Matamoro. And that's why, it's not a coincidence that we have, Santiago or Santiago. And of course, Anouar is among the top scholars who definitely, practiced a kind of ideology back in the fall of Granada, which is the beginning of many things, not only the discovery of the new world, but definitely the beginning of this, whatever we can call, So 1492, it's really a reference date that, Anouar keeps returning to. And I believe that, you can find this in his, we are all Moors unveiling traditions in order to understand, the problematics of, Islam in America, etc. But I believe that we can also talk about, the hyphen that connects and disconnects at the same time. And that's exactly, the dancing on the hyphen. It's precisely where, Anouar is located. And I believe that, along with Mignolo, he really represents this, writer who thinks across borders and who dwells on the borders. And, dwelling on the borders is really something that has a strong impact, and you can see this in his writings as well. Dwelling on the borders is also reflected in, his mobility from writing intellectual and, of course, scholarly books into writing fiction. This movement is extremely important, so I can only think of Khatibi doing this in Love in Two Languages and Annette Stockholm. I can think of Laroui as well, as if, he wanted to say something, but definitely, the biofiction is the proper space where he can continue this, dialogue. So without much ado, again, I will give the floor to maybe Yunus and then Morad.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased, honored, part in this panel. Yusuf, Second Chance in Tangier, two novels written by a Moroccan intellectual and novelist, Anouar Majid. In the beginning, I have to say that when my dear friend Khalid Amin asked me to participate in this panel, and he offered me a copy of A Second Chance in Tangier, I knew that I'm going to read in the word of the frame narrator of Joseph Conrad, and inconclusive, one of the inconclusive experience of Anouar Majid. So to be honest, it was difficult for me to read Anouar Majid's novel, Second Chance in Tangier, for my reading fails to detach itself from my previous reading of the first novel, Yusuf, published in 1992. As a reader, I was torn between two novels of Anouar Majid, weaving between the two novels, Lamine in Si Youssef as the narrator of the story and seeker of the truth about the enigmatic life of Si Youssef, and Lamine in Second Chance, who has the courage to leave behind a whole life that he has built in the United States for more than 35 years and returns back to his native city, which is half real and half supernatural. So throughout the 28 years interval that separates Youssef, 92, and Second Chance in Tangier, 2020, Lamine seems to perform a bridging act between a different historical moments and cultural context. In the first novel, Anouar Majid and his narrator Lamine strive to preserve and recover those lost micro-histories through a dynamic act of writing whose aim is not to recover those lost voices, memories of the city of Tangier, or to correct or scrutinize colonial hegemonic structure, but rather, in Mokhlis' words, to credit them with agency after they had been violently silenced, discredited, and discarded by the totalizing machine of colonial rule. Through textual practice which transcends negative binarism and favors hybridity and its alternatives, Anouar Majid's novel, Si Youssef, deploys subversive poetics as a strategy that, as argued by Mokhlis, would transcend the violent epistemic rupture caused by the West and would link past to present in such a way as to reinvent and reconstruct a post-colonial Moroccan identity capable of reconciling itself with its past, its tradition, religion, and eventually achieving an existential and ontological harmony with itself. More important is that Majid, Si Youssef, strives to construct a post-colonial identity through negotiating contradictory, antagonistic cultural and historical ideological visions and opening a space, a liminal space of translation and hybridity that goes beyond the given ground of opposition and boundaries. In doing so, Majid, through the life of Si Youssef and through the city of Tangier in the colonial and post-colonial period, celebrates a vision of self-fashioning that is not seeking for essences and originary communities, but for an openness towards different and divergent cultural and historical experiences to the extent of ensuing a hybridity that is open to an optimistic dialogue, cooperation, cross-pollination, as Alan Hibbert put it. In Si Youssef, Majid's conception of a new post-colonial identity that is free from narrow forms of nationalism and from reaction to the monolithic Eurocentric structure does justice to the richness and complexity of the city of Tangier as a crossroads city, and also to the plural identity of Si Youssef, who appropriates the pre- and post-Islamic Arabo-Berber cultural heritage of the Maghreb as it has been inscribed in an openness to the thoughts of the other. We can say that Majid's conception of the post-colonial identity as it is embodied in his central character, Si Youssef, is an optimistic conception of post-colonial Moroccan identity despite some cultural and historical boundaries that will obfuscate its realization and concretization, Majid's novel expresses a sharp consciousness of these boundaries when Lamin brings forth serious feeling of loneliness and regrets on the plane of his narrative when he say, for a while, I quote, for a while, I thought he had regretted his long marriage to a Spaniard who never become a Muslim. Such things happened, divided between his absolute loyalty to the woman he loved and his pride for the culture that made him. He vented his anger to the whirlwind, his anger at the whirlwind, the storm, the tempest of modern logic, the brutal and the unannounced clash of culture that is engendered, leaving behind it the fatal trail of homelessness, the feeling of being suspended in no man's land. With these words of Lamin about Yusuf that carry with them tones of pessimism and bewilderment, Anouar Majid, and after 28 years, publishes another novel, another story. But this time, it is a story of Lamin himself. Here, I would like to thank, where is he? Our dear friend, Aziz Jadir, who has been, as Majid says, insisting on writing a second novel of Yusuf. So thank you, Si Abdelaziz, to convince Si Majid to write the second novel. So Majid says that when he decided to write a second novel, he had no idea who the story was written for and what would become of it after it was done. I didn't even know what the final title would be. End of the quote. But Lamin appears again to throw a sort of light in the mind of Anouar Majid. Lamin, the younger narrator of Yusuf, was the only person and character who will enable Majid to reconnect to the voice, as said by Majid, to the voice that I had long lost. It's like going back in the second novel. So Second Chance in Tangier is a self-reflexive narrative in which Rafiq, a young Moroccan postgraduate student who postponed his PhD thesis just to write a book about Lamin. Rafiq strives to find out about Lamin's passions, loves, challenges, tragedies, his growing disenchantment with America, and his decision to return after 35 years to his native city. Majid's novel, Second Chance in Tangier, is not a story of a young Moroccan immigrant who leaves his country and his native city to study and teach in America, but it is a story of Lamin's return. The story of Lamin's return to Tangier after he has spent more than 35 years trying and struggling to understand and fit into a different culture. In Second Chance in Tangier, Lamin makes the right decision of return when he realizes that he is disillusioned by America. That was a nice and romantic idea, as he stated in the novel, in the beginning of his journey. But it has turned into a hard reality and into a place not to live in. With this realization, Lamin's return to his dream city can be seen as a bitter critique, a severe critique of America and Americans, a critique that articulates a vision of America, as Lamin tells Rafiq, a vast continent of opportunity, but it is not a place or a nation. It is still a land of people trying to belong, each and every one of us, and it is exhausting. Also, a vision about Americans through his recalling of Lakinza, the time Lamin was departing to the States. Lakinza's statement that says, Americans are the children of Gog and Magog. They have no roots, just a congregation of mlaqtin, rootless nobodies, trying to make it a new word. In recalling Lakinza statement, Lamin came to understand that America is a nation of a law-abiding citizen with no common heritage or memory together, all living under the shadow of vengeful law. More important, Lamin's disenchantment with America intensifies after the 9/11 attack, an event that allows Lamin to understand for the first time, as he say, how it feels to be black in America. You are what you appear to be, not who you really are. End of quotation. In identifying himself with the feelings of black people in America, Lamin, as a Moroccan Arab Muslim immigrant in the context of the 9/11, develop a new consciousness that makes him aware of being driven into a struggle and resistance against the paradigm of clash of cultures prescribed by Huntington. This feeling of estrangement developed by Lamin in the aftermath of 9/11 events and the shooting of his best friend Aziz by an air marshal were a turning point in Lamin's life and world vision towards culture, American culture and people. A vision that kills, I quote, whatever ambition and enthusiasm which had motivated me to take off 35 years before. So against the historical and cultural structure of the United States, Lamin finds himself forced to make his final decision of return. And in doing so, he is well conscious that he is about to sacrifice almost 4 decades of his life in the United States, a life that has given him an academic name and a family. Lamin's return can be seen as a denouncement of the monolithic American ideological structures that suffocates the different and divergent cultural and historical experiences of Lamin's in his native city of Tangier. Tangier as a city, as a crossroad city that has shaped his identity as well as it had done with Yusuf, who lived and rejoiced the spirit of Tangier as a dream city. And I can end with Marlowe saying, we live as we dream. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yunus, for such an enlightening reading of Second Chance. So, Morad, thank you very much for being with us. And Morad is not only professor of literature, but also he's a writer of fiction himself.
Thank you, Professor Khalid. First of all, I would like to thank you and whoever took part in the organization of this event to involve me and to invite me to take part in this. It's always a pleasure, and it's also a great pleasure to meet Anouar Majid again after so many years, and I'm very sort of honored and delighted to be here today. I first came across Anouar Majid's work when he published a very provocative article following the Salman Rushdie affair. Orientalism and the Rushdie affair. Can the post-colonial critic speak? And it had special meaning for me because a few years earlier, I had completed a thesis, my master's thesis, on Salman Rushdie's fiction. But when I was working on my thesis, the controversial satanic verses had not been published yet. And clearly, what Anouar Majid had to say about the Rushdie affair really resonated with me. It was extremely relevant because it was basically sort of really pointing in a different direction with regard to how to receive and how to read the work of Salman Rushdie. And that article really has great importance in what I would call not so much post-colonial theory, but it's actually an article that has ushered in, or helped usher in, the post-colonial theory. I think when we sort of go back and read the article, I think it was published in 1996 or 95, and really the premises of decoloniality are being sort of drafted and drawn here. And of course, the article had an impact amongst other sort of contributions in the way Salman Rushdie was received in literary and cultural circles in the West, and especially in Britain. You may remember that when he published the book, and especially his novel Midnight's Children, he was really the upcoming darling of literary circles in the UK. And I think it's really through some of these articles that kind of reframed the way we could read that kind of fiction that is important. I also followed Anouar Majid's work on the relationship between Islam and the West and America. Very provocative work again, a call for heresy that really, again, really problematized the way we approach and we see the place of Islam, the place of Muslim identity in a globalized culture. And this is something that is really made a notable seminal contribution, in my opinion. But what is interesting for me today, and this is what I would like to share with you, is that I discovered Anouar Majid's fiction much more recently. And one of the questions that guided my reading of his two novels was, how does an academic and diasporic intellectual who has been engaged in a very far-reaching cultural and political debate and has produced very, very sort of important contributions to our understanding of cultural and political dynamics around the world, how does an intellectual of that nature transfer that insight into narrative and fictional form? I started reading the novels with the idea that this was really a very risky endeavor, because in many ways, that theoretical baggage is really something that you have to handle with great care when you cross over to the world of fiction. And it's really very important because I will invite you to survey the cultural and literary landscape around the world. How many names can you come up with of people who made a contribution, a notable contribution, when it comes to, let's say, critical theory or literary theory, and then also have a fairly happy time of moving across to fiction? The premises are different. Perhaps the desire to kind of use that sort of intellectual substance to tell a story, to create characters, to imagine situations, and to sort of use some of these sort of requirements of fiction writing there is quite tricky. In fact, it brings to mind a quote by a British critic by the name of Kenneth Tynan, who once said, put it in very simple terms, he said, "The critic is a person who knows the way but can't drive the car." Trying to kind of like distinguish between the two functions. So this was one of the premise of my experience with reading the novels by Anouar Majid. And I have to say, with all honesty, that to use the same image, Anouar Majid knows the way and also knows how to drive the car. Because in many ways, when we look at his two novels, he has taken that sort of outlook, we can call it theoretical outlook, that post-colonial outlook, that decolonial outlook, he has really taken it across to the realm of fiction. And he has used it not as something that overburdens the requirements of telling a story, because essentially that is what writers do. He has actually found sort of like bridging points, very quite subtle bridging points, because one of the things that perhaps the risk that I was mentioning before was this idea of trying to over-intellectualize fiction writing. And I think when I started reading Second Chance in Tangier, and then I read C. Yusuf afterwards, and really to see that this is an academic who is moving across and telling us a story with the same compelling feel as the one that we can have when we are reading some of his sort of theoretical and academic work. So the risk, in my opinion, was worth taking. And I think Anouar Majid really sort of like took on the challenge and did, as we've heard from the other panelists, a wonderful job with his two novels here. Now, I will also share with you what I see as kind of like moving into fiction, but also using some of the insight that comes from his sort of academic and intellectual careers. And I think it has been pointed out earlier by my fellow panelists. These two novels are hymns to the city of Tangier, to its, I'll use a phrase from one of the novels, its cosmopolitan gene. These intertwined lives of local Moroccans, foreigners, Christians, Spaniards, Jews. This focus on the cafe scene, which was kind of like highlighted earlier. What a wonderful venue for that kind of basic human interaction. Places that morph into spaces for discussion, for exchange, that in many ways kind of lead to this fleeting, unassuming knowledge. And what is really remarkable in the two stories is the attention that is paid to this cafe scene, this cafe culture, and especially the tenderness, the attention that is paid to ordinary folks in the city. And that is really where you feel that kind of sense of returning to forms of being that may have been neglected, or returning to forms of knowledge that may have been erased by sort of dominant narrative. I think Khalid Amin mentioned Walter Mignolo when he was talking about the idea of the colonial matrix of power and the dominance of a particular sort of Western narrative. Whereas these two novels are really paying attention to the people that we do not pay attention to. And what they have to say is really made important, is really made significant and relevant. All that all the movement, all the interactions between the characters is really to bring to the fore what the city has to say and what its people have to say. And it's interesting that we can see with the two main characters in both novels that it takes a very long trajectory to return to these forms of being and these forms of knowledge. Another phrase that I would like to quote from the article on Orientalism and Salman and the Rushdie affair, this beautiful phrase that says that Anouar Majid talks about the ephemeral attraction of Western culture. This idea that over time there is something that is going to, in a sense, push through this kind of sort of fascination with what can be seen as the dominant narrative. I will read you a passage, a very brief passage from one of these scenes, and that really illustrates this very beautifully. And the narrator says, "I was introduced to the world of anonymous men on the verge of extinction, and these men talking of the fabulous wonder of their collective unrecorded past, suddenly making of the legitimate knowledge I had been acquiring for years in public and private institutions, an intolerable lie," which really kind of speaks to this approach that we can see sort of like being weaved into the narrative and through what the characters live through. And the other idea that I have picked up, I think Anthony sort of touched on that a little bit, is the notion of mentorship. That is, again, the same idea sort of echoes in both stories where Si Yusuf and Lamin have precious knowledge to impart. And they have, the narrator, the characters are there to, in a sense, revisit and to highlight the value of that kind of sort of knowledge. And it is really through this journey, through memory, through this journey, through time, through this journey, through space, bridging all these different sort of cultures, bridging all these different languages, that this sort of basis for a kind of a more humane future is sort of drawn. And I think that through these very sort of like casual conversations, through this kind of like pushing through a very different approach to what it means to be either somebody who lives in there completely immersed in the local culture, or somebody who has gone through different kinds of experiences and has learned a great deal about this. And again, I can only highlight, as has been said before, some of the most mesmerizing passages in this book. In A Second Chance in Tangier, the way the writer or the narrator addresses the 9/11 attacks and the impact that those attacks have on the Muslim character who is in the US and has to process the sort of this particular attack, how it has been, in a sense, sort of perceived, what it means also for someone of Muslim faith to look at something like that has been done, supposedly in the name of the religion of the character. And that whole introspection that Lamin goes through is just, it's exactly the kind of response that has been kind of like, it's been in the making, and he does articulate this kind of like this view of what it means to be confronted with this kind of event and what kind of questions it brings up. So really, I go back to where I started, and this notion of whether this passage from these concerns about post-coloniality, about identity issues, about Islam and the West, whether this travels and translates into novelistic form. And I have to say that these are very compelling novels that not only give us that sense, that kind of intellectual substance, but really do it through storytelling and through very sort of strong characters and a very good eye for what matters when you are sort of trying to convey that kind of vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Murad McKinsey. Actually, it's a wonderful reading, and particularly when you mentioned the issue of the article of Can the Post-Colonial Speak? And here, particularly, and throughout the oeuvre of Anouar Majid, I believe that what he's doing is reconceptualizing the post-colonial stance, in a completely different way, and bringing it to a new trajectory, which is actually full of agency. Agency, not وكالة, but قوة الفعل. Okay? And of course, the crossing over from theory and intellectual writings into, fiction, it's, you did, a wonderful job explaining this, crossing. And I believe that it's very hard to read Yusuf or also Second Chance without reading, for scholars, for the PhD students, etc., without reading the rest of the books of Anouar Majid. You can read it for fun, you can read it for pleasure, but for those who are working on the works of Anouar Majid, I find it extremely important to read all the oeuvre. We are all Moors, a call for heresy, etc., because there are remnants and residues of all these in the encounters, like Linda, for example, in Second Chance, which is an amazing conversation between Lamine and the other character. Also, the question of Spain. Spain is all the time there, in the back of the mind of Anouar Majid. It's brought again and again in the fiction, but definitely when you read, we are all Moors, you understand that, that's exactly where we should start digging and practicing a kind of archaeology of knowledge to understand, the new constructs of the Moors, and as we are all Moors. So without much ado, I think we will have a reception, maybe in 10-15 minutes, but before that, I give the floor to Anouar to respond to. Anouar will be speaking.
Well, very أريد أن أشكر سعادة العميد كلية. شكرا جزيلا للترحيب والاستقبال. I just wanted to thank the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters at the University of Abd Malik Saadi, who's here with us. He was the one who honored us with a presentation in the beginning, introductions. And I want to thank literally everyone in this room. The Khalid Amin, of course, who organized this event, who is a very dear friend now. And I'm going to talk about Aziz later. And I want to thank also students from Abd Malik Saadi University who took the time to come and be among us. I don't know how many of you are there, but I assume, raise your hands. Okay, great, a good number of students. So that's a good sign. And I also want to thank the students of the University of New England who are in Morocco for a week. And how many are here in this room now? Raise your hand. So all these people are leaving tomorrow. They live in Tangier tomorrow. And somehow they took the time to be with us and miss out on all the explorations that they haven't made yet of Tangier. So thank you so much for making this and watching a bunch of grown-up academics talk about each other. So thank you so much for making. Before I comment on some of these comments, I also want to thank my colleagues who teach at the University of New England here, Murad and his wife, Aziz and Aziz Yadin and a bunch of others, and all the other critics. Some of you I don't know yet, so please excuse me, but I really thank everyone in this room. I don't know how to respond to. I don't know how to respond to all of this. Honestly, I don't, because it reminds me of, there's a very famous writer, for those of you who don't know him, just in case, because some people don't major in the humanities here. There's a very big writer of Latin America, Colombian origin, his name Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I remember many years ago, soon after, I can't remember now, it's getting too old, soon after his book, 100 Years of Solitude, came out in English, and that book was translated by somebody called Gregorio Rabasa, if you probably know the name. And they asked Gabriel Garcia Marquez, what do you think of the translation? I remember, before I tell you what his answer was, I remember I was once in Turkey many years ago, and I was speaking to a Turkish audience, and I had a translator because they don't understand English, and I don't understand Turkish. So I would say something like this. I would say, today I went to the university and spoke to a professor. So my Turkish translator will, and then there's a blank look on the faces of the audience and the faces in the room, and the Turkish translator starts saying things like this. I'm sorry if I'm mimicking the Turkish language, but and all of a sudden the faces in the audience started lighting up. But then he wouldn't stop. He kept going. And I thought I only mentioned one sentence. He's translating only one sentence. But by that time, he'd already said the equivalent of 2 paragraphs. And they were really laughing and responding and everything else. So at the end of his translation, I remembered how Gabriel Garcia Marquez had answered the question about Gregorio Rabasa. I can only say, Marquez said, to that question, answer to the question was, I think Gregorio Rabasa wrote a better book than mine. And I think my colleagues, my friends who commented on my work have a better understanding of my work. They see better things in it. They probably know more about post-colonial theory and cultural studies and the relationships between East and West than I probably do. And I was the one who was being mesmerized watching you individually, and there were so many comments that I tried to jot down, but I don't have enough time to comment on all of them. But was it you, Tony, who mentioned Hercules and 12 days of labor? I never thought of that. I don't know how and there are other things that happen in these books that I don't know where they come from. They've been there for many decades, or I don't know how many decades, 28 years or so. And then all of a sudden I realized, yes, there's a relationship between the 12 days and Hercules' 12 labors. So, and there's so many other things, buying shoes. Buying shoes, let me make another confession. I just bought a pair of shoes from Bata. I went all the way to Soco Alto Mall to buy a pair of shoes because I wanted to buy Bata shoes. Because Bata is like the brand of our childhoods. You can't beat Bata. No, you can't beat Bata. So I said, now I'm a proud owner of a pair of shoes from Bata. So, there's so many things that was said here, and one of the writing itself is a risk, and I like the comment Murad you made about it's very, I'm quoting you, it's very risky. It's a very risky endeavor to transition from writing nonfiction academic work to writing novels. But it's interesting that in every step I felt, at every step of the way I was doing my work, I always felt that I was transgressing something. at least the feeling of transgression has inhabited me from day one. Like my first article you mentioned, kind of the post-colonial critic speak, the publisher, the editor of that journal, you know, one of the reviewers recommended that Edward Said respond to me in that piece, and he basically this editor, Abdul Jah Mohammed, you know, said basically he was asking me, who are you? You know, you're just a young scholar and you're writing these things about the Gayatri Spivak and Edward Said and all that stuff. But it's like, I said, I'm nobody. I'm just writing however, the way I feel, the way I think, and the way so ever since then, I've always felt that I was transgressing some spoken or unspoken taboo. And including when I wrote, so there was a huge shift after I wrote I Call for Heresy. So at least in the United States, you know, when people before then had seen me as a critic of imperialism, Western hegemony, and all of that, and all of a sudden I was turning my gaze now, I was turning my aim at our own traditions and how they can be equally oppressive. People had forgotten that in the Marxist tradition, which I kind of, you know, was associated with in one way or another, that you need to be an equal opportunity critic and fighter of injustice, however, whatever shape and whatever language it comes in. So that was my main motivation in doing that. You're reading about post-colonial identities, and those are all fascinating topics. I mean, you know, I can go on talking about this. You know, the place of Tangier too is a big one, but the place of Tangier as an impossible to define space. I was today on a radio program with Aziz and Radio Tangier, and when you try to explain what Tangier means to you, you kind of stymied by that effort, because it's impossible to pin it down. And we don't have a great Medina like Marrakesh and Fez and other places. You know, the city, there's nothing exceptional about the city, yet it is very attractive, it is very mysterious, it is very, it lures a lot of people to it. And so that is the thing you need to explain. It's a place, it's a different kind of space. And but it also represents a kind of diversity, that existed before the rise of identity politics in the United States and other places. And so, I mean, there's so much to say about that as well. So, one more thing, you know, I have a friend of mine, he's a businessman in Casablanca, I'm not going to mention his name, very American-educated businessman. One day he challenged me after he read Second Chance in Tangier by saying, now, Lamin returns to Tangier. Now he's made that commitment, and you have to honor it. So the open question is, will I? So thank you so much, you know, for doing that. Thank you. I'm really humbled.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the sequel of this academic event. This is how we're going to proceed today. We're going to give a chance to each of the panelists, you know, to deliver their thoughts and insights for about 5 minutes. And I have to say that not all the, of course, the presentations will be in English. There will be a presentation in Arabic, but I can assure you that interpreting services are provided. Once again, I'm very happy that Khalid gave me a second chance in 10 years. But this time in my capacity as a moderator, so I would like each one of the panelists, you know, to keep to the time that has been allotted to them, because it's going to get late in the evening, so, okay. So I'll give the floor to Professor Mimoun Daoudi. He's a professor of cultural studies, University of Fez. And so feel free to either, you know, use the podium or speak from wherever you're seated.
Yeah, thank you.
The floor is
Mr.
yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me first express my sincere gratitude to Professor Khalid Amin for involving me in this roundtable discussion or in this panel. Khalid Amin for almost 2 decades, a friend, generous friend, a distinguished scholar, and a really Moroccan academic. Thank you very much, Khalid. I've been here in 2016 in the same place with Mr. Professor Anouar Majid discussing Islam and America, building a future without prejudice. And Majid asked a very shaking question that still works and it's still shaking and it's still working as far as I'm concerned. He said following, how many of you have Christian and Jewish friends? It was a very, very shaking question, for me at least, and for the audience, because now dialogue, openness is very necessary for the future of humanity. Majid is always present with me in Fez, in Tal Mahrez, because I teach CUs to my MA Cultural Studies students. And my students are very eager to know more about the narratives of Anouar Majid and his critical work. I'm going to focus on CUs simply because it's the premise, it's the background for what came later in Majid's critical work, Unveiling Traditions, Call for Heresy, and the last one, Islam and America, Building a Future Without Prejudice. So my paper tries to explore his narrative in terms of space making and remaking, and Tangier as a post-colonial space which is embedded with intersecting and sometimes opposing elements, which stands as a place where cultural consciousness is stimulated and eventually dismantled. So the present analysis tries to examine and elucidate the fact that the city fuels Western and Arab Islamic ongoing narratives of identity in a post-colonial era, of identity transformation. Within a rapidly shifting world geopolitical map, a growing need to define one's position has gathered momentum. And the quest for self-affirmation from marginalized communities has become increasingly noticeable. So the narrative attempts to respond to the identity narrative construction in an increasingly mobilized world. Home, Tangier. One can think of the historical, cultural repertoires that make a nation. So Anouar Majid contemplates the Muslim reality in the new global age throughout his critical works. The books he published tries to shake the European rhetoric of equality, humanity, and brotherhood. And in a similar line, he awakens the post-independent subjectivity to appreciate difference. And beware of the exploitative Western discourse of dominance that is embedded in new wave of late capitalism. Majid, in this case, builds strong ties with the culturalists who insist that people ought to preserve and nourish their own traditions and resist the tempting illusion of melting into an alienating cosmopolitanism. C. Yusuf is an instance of a post-colonial narrative that shake the past and make silent history come to word through imagining alternative scripts of the past. Indeed, the past becomes very necessary to understand the present. It's through the malleable memory that post-colonial diasporic subjects construct the lost homeland, positioned at the interstices of different spaces, histories, and languages, these subjects delve into transcultural and transnational existences, and novel paradigms of identity intervene within past identities. Therefore, history turns into a story, a narrated past. I quote, "The past continues to speak to us," Hall insists or notes. It no longer addresses us as simple factual past, since our relation to it, like the child's relation to the mother, is always already after the break. It's necessary, or it's always constructed through memory, fantasy, narrative, and myth. So see use of the mythic, as already mentioned in the previous panel, the mythic, the fictitious, and the real dance arm in arm. So this narrative interweaves stories within stories, reflecting a complex post-colonial state that shuns essentialism and problematizes fixed identities and reflects the fragmented postmodern culture. So the novel is in fact an epitome of post-colonial narratives of exile, as Khalid said in his previous panel, and diaspora. Characters in this text are built in such a way as to describe post-colonial diasporic subjects longing for incessant homeward journeys. So this idea of traveling back home is very, very important in understanding both texts, both novels. This narrative attempts to dismantle the Western centrality of history. So the narrator, the old, to Yusuf and wise, in this case, articulates a different conceptualization of history. The novel's central character sees Yusuf, an old, culture-bound Moroccan man whose occupation of and attachment to the land stands in the way of his country's development. In fact, the narrative brings the post-colonial subjectivity into reconciliation with its past, history and tradition and religion. Crossing temporal and spatial boundaries through their creation of histories and memories, C. Yusuf and Lamin attest to the creation of an alternative space to represent the double texture and complexities of national experience and cultural belonging. As Majid is keen to show us, it's the space of overlap that interfaces between lives, that appropriately embodies the palimpsestic complexities of a Moroccan cultural and national consciousness. That C. Yusuf's stories are woven and interwoven within Lamin's first-level narrative, makes the novel a set of interrelated episodes, very much dear to the postmodern conception of the fabrication of reality. Therefore, the space of Tangier seems to be constructed and reconstructed, made and remade according to C. Yusuf's reminiscences of glorious past. C. Yusuf dismantles the diegetic reader's logic by asking him to, I quote, "Consider this story of mine a lie. Cheap fiction, a mere attempt to dump my frustration on you," end of quote. In times, he makes the reader follow the events taking place in their historical context, while in others, he deflates this reliability by confessing that those stories are mere constructions of random confessions in obscure cafes, obscure cities, and obscure countries. In a chef's cafe, the act of telling takes place in 12 days, summarizing a rather longer period of Moroccan history. Each meeting consists of an episode whereby senses of past events take place in the space of Tangier. Lamin acts as a prompter, a commentator on C. Yusuf's stories about the cosmopolitan life in Tangier. Quote, "I wish I didn't work or evoke those irritating subjects," Lamin regrets. And here lies the intelligence of Majid, as Khalid said, interweaving some critical work like Khatibi, saying what is not, or what's hard to say in critical work through a narrative or through literature. I did my best to direct his attention to other subjects, for he was an extremely irritable and sensitive man. He listens attentively to the old man's reminiscences of the heydays when he was a talib reciting Quranic verses for the dead in Marchand Cemetery in Tangier, a soccer player, a tourist guide, and a bookstore keeper. C. Yusuf stands for the microcosmic and multidimensional personality which captures post-colonial quest for self-realization. Omar, Si Yusuf's eldest son, is a microcosm of a new version of the educated. He is the hope. And that's why I consider Si Yusuf as a narrative of hope. And Majid's hope is in Morocco and in Tangier. That's why we have this very, very wonderful building which marries the past and the present, the traditional and the modern. His identity is based on nationalism, independence, democracy, human rights. It was well expressed, articulated in the language of newspapers, left and right. So his life oscillates between the past manifested through his father and the present, where change is constantly taking place. He represents the beginning of a new time, the beginning of a new time, the beginning of a new subject capable of moderate dialogue, a new version of the educated generation. Omar and Lamin are types of post-colonial subjects who long for changing in the Moroccan they live in. So the narrative shuttles between the past and the present in an indeterminate and incomplete way. It finds us across different points in the history of Tangier and that of Morocco. Different registers of textuality and narrative are wrapped up in a series of constant and endless stability or instability. To illustrate, the text displays periods of French colonization, Moroccan struggle for independence, and independent Morocco as sparkling points in the history of contemporary Morocco. I will go through okay, so I don't know whether time is enough for addressing some other issues, but the oral and the written textual forms go hand in hand. For Si Yusuf, narration is mainly oral, while Lamin's is written. Lamin represents the word of literacy in Morocco, whereas Si Yusuf epitomizes the wide population of illiterate Moroccans who depend on orality and memory to archive history. Hence, two distinct and different generations linking the past and the present are brought together in a place of incommensurable contradictions. Here I raise the issue of legitimacy, legitimate knowledge, very important issue, raised in 2016 with Islam and America and the question of writing after 150 years, if you remember, Majid, when you talked about that. So, legitimate knowledge, a place, so I skip Tangier as a border city because it's already mentioned in the previous panel. Majid asserts that Tangier is a port city. As a port city is historically very interesting and usually tends to be more liberal. I quote you, more liberal than the hinterlands because it's exposed to outside influences. Tangier is more liberal than Marrakesh and Fez. So, and another issue, which is memory, which becomes a fundamental alternative space for the narrator and writer to construct his hometown Tangier. So diasporic writers like Majid grapple with questions of cultural identity, Khalid mentioned in this previous panel. They negotiate a space in between. So Majid and many other writers seek in the past they left behind a refuge from the unsettled diasporic experience. Indeed, they seek to reclaim their very identity by using, I quote, the artistic freedom and insights of detachment provided by that very exile, finding security in the home of memory, which is relentlessly mined to recreate a sense of identity and cultural belonging. And writing becomes a geography for Majid. It's the third geography. Remembering becomes a fundamental process in identity construction, and writing becomes itself a way of remembering and a strategy of survival. So memory serves both to deal with the seemingly forgotten past and as a necessary step toward reinventing the self. Lamin, the first-level narrator, who might be Majid himself, strategically turns to the act of writing to guarantee a certain degree of redemption. By way of conclusion, Majid, Si Yusuf, and Lamin find in narration a space of convenient to replace the lost and rather ignored homeland. Indeed, throughout his work, Majid tries to make the West aware of the existence of other histories that should not be ignored. At the same time, he shakes Western hegemony, or hegemonic centrality. Through the excavation of and unearthing of memories, he uncovers suppressed or hidden histories and cultural experiences to construct an alternative narrative of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Daoudi. I think one thing to retain is memory, but I would say memory work. And I don't think, I think we need now more than ever memory workers in addition to social workers, because the paradigm change, from socioeconomic rights to cultural and language rights. And I can tell you for sure that in countries where they have what is called the First Nations people, in Canada, in the US, of course, in New Zealand and Australia, people are claiming back their own customs and sometimes funeral rights. And they're holding the government for having funerals that do not really respect who they are. The other thing is, I think now we're at a time when we need the emotional economy, because there is an economy of rage. Murad earlier spoke about Salman Rushdie and how he was mired in the polemic or maybe controversy around satanic verses. But there was another woman, Monica Ali, who wrote a book, Brick Lane, who also could have really faced the same sort of dire and dreadful prospect. One last thing, I think now, the political is personal. And I think we need to start from the anecdote. And I'm glad that Anouar Majid, in his book, A Second Chance in Tangier, mentions Stephen Greenblatt, who is a Shakespearean at Harvard University, and I knew him personally, and who really sees how you can actually achieve the micro patterns of history through the anecdote. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to our next panelist, because we can speak about this forever. This is a happy event, but time is not on our side. I have a friend who used to say, if you can't be brief, be witty. So, Abdulaziz Lamrani, Professor of Literary Studies at Abdul Malik Saadi University, Tetuan, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairperson. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Khaled Amin for his kind invitation to take part in this debate on obedient child of Tangier, let's say. Let me put it that way. Well, I have known Anouar Majid for a long time when I was doing my PhD on post-colonialism and religion, particularly on Islam, relationship between Islam and post-colonialism. And now it's my second chance to be sitting behind this podium, and meeting Anouar Majid in person is something which I will always remember. So in his book, Democracy Matters, Cornel West describes Anouar Majid as one of the few towering Islamic intellectuals. When I was doing my PhD on post-colonialism and Islam 7 years ago, Majid's critical works were of great help to me, considered as an exception, because when we talk about the relationship between post-colonialism and Islam, for many they are oxymoron, they are mutually exclusive. It's rare to find some, works written by post-colonial writers from purely Muslim perspective. So consider it as an exception. Anouar Majid can be regarded as one of the most eminent Muslim post-colonial critics who attempt to integrate Islam within the post-colonial framework before 9/11. In his attempt to reconcile the progressive forms of Islam within post-colonial thinking, Majid claims that Islam and Muslim thinkers continue to be denied access within post-colonialism. In his book Unveiling Traditions, Post-Colonial Islam in a Polycentric World, Majid declares that among post-colonial scholars, there is a lack of willingness to engage with Islam. Majid is not only a cultural critic, but also is a novelist. So in this paper, I'm going to talk about his second novel, which is titled Second Chance in Tangier, and hopefully we'll get a third chance in the upcoming events. So, which was, of course, published in 2020. Using post-secularism and secular spirituality as analytical tools, I will read the novel from a post-secular perspective, and more specifically, from a secular spiritual perspective. Majid's novel, Second Chance in Tangier, belongs to different distinct genres, such as 9/11 literature, because after 9/11, a number of novelists, have initiated, let's say, a new type of literature, which is called post-9/11 literature or 9/11 literature, which talks about the 9/11 events and its aftermath on the collectivist and individualistic identities. So, and also, Majid's novel belongs to transatlantic literature, because there are two chapters in that novel. The first one is titled The New World, and the other one is titled Old World. And of course, in master program, I'm teaching in the spring semester a very good course titled Transatlantic Literary Connections, which I study some at transatlantic texts, and hopefully I could include this novel in my syllabus. Also, this novel, which is Second Chance in Tangier, belongs to, of course, a new type of literature, which is still, let's say, on the making, still embryonic, which is titled Transnational Narratives of the Return, or Narratives of Redemption and Fulfillment, and above all, it belongs to a new type of literature called post-secular literature. Enough texts have been written to contend that there is a distinct genre of written home stories by post-colonial migrant writers. Novels that constitute narratives of return reveal how diasporic identity continues to be informed by a particularized connection to the native homeland and ancestral spiritual roots. One study of migration literature notes, I quote, "Finally, it must be noted that amongst all the literature of migration, the highest proportion deals in some way with ideas of return, whether actualized or imagery or remaining imaginary. To return may be to go back, but it may equally be to start again, to seek but also to lose. Return has both a temporal and spatial dimension. For the individual returning their own past and place, it is rarely fully satisfying. Circumstances change, borders in all senses are altered, and identities change too." The end of quote. And of course, I'm going to sound a little bit too academic because I'm going to bombard you with some quotations from the novel. Okay. So in this sense, Majid's Second Chance in Tangier is a return novel because it presents the story of Lamine, who left Morocco to study and teach in America, and after 35 years, he decided to return to his native Tangier. Like other returnees, such as Muhammad in Tahar Bajaloun's novel, which was, of course, written in 2009, titled Upi, but it is translated into English in 2011, under the title A Palace in the Old Village. So Muhammad, after 45 years living in the suburbs of Paris, he left everything behind and went back to his village in the outskirts, in the suburbs of Agadir. So, and also, like other returns such as Muhammad in Tahar Bajaloun's A Palace in the Old Village, and changes in Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, Lamine, the protagonist of of Majid's novel left America and returned to Tangier because his, I quote, soul had shrank the size of raisin over there. After the end of quote, after 9/11, Lamin had his own idea of America. And for him, America had become dehumanized and lost its nerve, becoming both a romantic idea and a hard reality. In America, Lamin didn't find himself because there is no soul or spirit there. He says, I quote, to say that there were the best years of my life would be an exaggeration. Those belonged to Fez. It was there that I was awakened to love, all sorts of love, but it was in New York that I consumed my pleasures over and over again, the end of quote. For Lamin, I quote again, America's glamour has faded and it has turned into a discount empire for brand-conscious shoppers. He also adds, I quote, Americans are the children of Gog and Magog, they have no roots, just a congregation of mlaqtin, ruthless nobodies trying to make it a new land. It's important to note here that this country of mlaqtin hasn't embraced and contained Lamin because modern American culture, I quote, has stripped life of its spirit and reduced everything commercial transactions. In this ruthless consumer capitalist culture, Lamin, I quote, kept sinking deeper and deeper into the underworld of secular pleasures. I just couldn't stop, the end of quote. In addition, the Enlightenment, I quote again, the Enlightenment with its cult of reason and exaggerating worship of science was so cold for us, the end of quote. What can be drawn here is that in his novel, Anouar Majid attempts to criticize American culture for not being spiritual enough. Confronted with racism, Islamophobia, and the rise of essentializing discourses after the 9/11 attacks, Lamin decided to answer the spiritual call of Tangier. In fact, 9/11 has been an occasion or a catalyst which pushes the individuals to reevaluate and re-examine their own identities. For Rafiq, Lamin returned to Tangier, I quote, to look for the places that were still untouched by America's peculiar psyche. Rafiq, for example, asked Lamin, how do you find the social life here, in Tangier? Lamin answered, as good as it ever was, a bit too busy for my taste, but our culture endures. You just have to look a bit harder to find it. It's definitely there, everywhere. I asked what he meant by culture, and he simply said, spirit, just spirit. So America is lacking spirit. Although he spent many years in America, Lamin was still dreaming of his childhood friends, beach, hammamas, school, and even the faqih of Bukhash Khash. To seek solace and comfort, Lamin, I quote, kept listening to the Algerian song, Ya Rayah, Wina Msafir, and then you will come back. So this story, of course, can be applied, as a tool in order to read, Majid's novel. So to seek solace and comfort, Lamin kept listening to the Algerian song Ya Rayah, gradually sensing, without yet being fully aware of his inclinations, that a man never truly leaves his country, that no place can take Morocco or Tangier out of him, no matter what. Lamin says, America can be stimulating, but no one can break the spell of Morocco and Tangier have on us. My soul has called me back. So this, is talking. My soul has called me back just like that. It had been whispering in my ears for decades, years. It grew strident in its persistence. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I can't wait much longer for the promised land. My ancestral one has more powerful claim now. Don't forget too, we are very lucky. I'm not back in some failed state. I am in Morocco, Tangier, the only place where I can be full myself. To seek rootedness and salvation, Lamin not only resorts to literature and art, of course, It's a very important subject which I do recommend my students, especially in students and PhD students, to explore it in art and literature as spiritual practices. Okay, so to seek rootedness and salvation, Lamin not only resorts to literature and art, but also to his home. Home is often invoked as sacred, as a crucible of meaning and identity in the contemporary diasporic world. In particular, land and landscapes adopt a spiritual meaning. In their book titled Mapping the Sacred, Religion, Geography, and Post-Colonial Literatures, Jenny S. Scott and Paul Simpson Hosley remind us that colonialism began with the, I quote, the invasive appropriation of physical land and material resources, the end of quote. The sacredness of the land is often altered as a consequence of the establishment of invasive territories and borders. Post-colonial writers therefore enact and represent the way in which land and landscapes, as a result of colonialism, I quote, may be viewed as now sacred, now desacralized, and now resacralized, the end of quote. In Second Chance in Tangier, Anouar Majid depicts homeland as a sacred space that might provide remedies to social ills and alternatives to current troubled living conditions in this capitalist world. In his novel, Majid wants to say that we cannot get disconnected from our spiritual roots, even after we die. For instance, his close friend, Aziz, was not a devout Muslim and was critical of Arab Islamic culture, but he was killed as a suspicious terrorist. And my name is Abdul Aziz, but all my family members call me Aziz. And of course, when I read Aziz's story, it had a deep or profound impact on me. Okay, and of course, there were a lot of victims of collateral damage because the first, when I read a number of novels written by a South Asian novelist, the first victim of the 9/11, okay, was a Sikh because he was wearing a turban, and everybody who looked like Muslim was a target by the supremacist. So he was killed, of course, because he was in the eyes of the police a suspicious terrorist. He was killed and buried in his home in Connecticut, but Quran was recited in Tangier for the mercy of his soul. I quote, "When we die, our cultures claim us back against our, well, let me reflect it. The killing of Aziz and other subsequent hate crimes have created within Lamin, a spiritual epiphany. In fact, the theme of the spiritual turn or post-secular turn is one of the most predominant themes in post-9/11 literature. Not only in post-9/11 literature, but also in the humanities and social sciences. Again, nowadays we are witnessing a lot of turns within feminism, turns within literature studies, cultural studies, etc. Interestingly, Anouar Majid's Second Chance in Tangier can be read as a post-secular text. In post-secular literature, religion, non-religious spirituality, and secularism converge and diverge and are transformed around questions of human meaning, transcendence and immanence, pain and joy, the reality and unreality of life in the 20th and 21st century world. Literary scholars writing about the post-secular rarely suggest that post-secular represents an outright return from the secular to the religious, but they do suggest that it represents variously either a renewed or continued engagement with religion in apparently increasingly or at least persistently secular culture. A third position between the religious and the secular that includes aspects of both, a dissolving of the boundaries between the categories of religious and secular, a crossing of those boundaries while leaving them intact, or a revision of the religious in light of certain secular ideas and ideals. Most of the characters in the novel, such as Pedro, Amran, Si Mustafa, Linda, Jen, including Lamin, are post-secular. It is true that Lamin criticized America, but he is grateful to it and its people for saving his son, Yusuf. He celebrates his post-secular and global identity. I mean, the interaction between the secular, spiritual, and the global and the local. He celebrates his post-secular and global identity. He, I quote, was already in the intermediate zone between heaven and earth, flesh and soul, one foot in New York, the other in Tangier. Lamin was, I quote, trained to connect the continents. In brief, Lamin's return to Tangier is a spiritual journey in the sense that he wants to seek his spiritual roots and rescue himself from a meaningless consumer life in America. The return to the sacred in Tangier is a manifestation of Lamin's quest for spirituality. His homecoming journey, of course, as I said before, is a spiritual journey. Importantly enough, in his novel, Majid presents Islam as faith, a spiritual practice, a religiosity which is not associated with any political doctrine or organization. Lamin's uncle, for example, and grandfather had a deep influence on him. His uncle, Si Mustafa, was believed to be a saint. He died single. He didn't get married. Whose beautiful recitation of the Quran never failed to convey the mercy Allah had for his creation. His grandfather was a prominent, I quote, was a prominent member of the Tangier order. So here we have the focus on Sufism. And of course, you know, Professor Anouar Majid, of course, is trying to celebrate what we call spiritual or Sufi mystic identity, spiritual identity which is not connected to any kind of dogmas, be it political or religious. So, it was a prominent member of the Tangier order. I quote, "It was the haunting voice of his uncle that led Amin to take the tape cassettes of Abdurrahman bin Musa, the emblem of the Moroccan Quranic voice, with him back to America after his marriage and to listen to his tapes as he drove to work in his car." The end of quote. Anouar Majid here attempts to celebrate Moroccan Islam that was practiced before the arrival of the poison of the East. For him, I quote, "Egyptian preachers and Saudi TV networks started beaming their views into our homes." Lamin, I quote, "was disturbed by the black and white threat of our political media narratives. Osama bin Laden's Islam was not his. His image of Islam, perhaps the only one, now that I think of it, was his clean-shaven uncle, Si Mustafa, with his angelic voice, not the harsh tones of bearded Saudis, Iraqis, Afghanis, and the like." The end of quote. As a progressive voice of Islam, and by criticizing Eurocentric secularism and Islamic fundamentalism, Majid calls for the secularization of Islam and the spiritualization of secularism. Put simply, Majid is upholding post-secular values by negotiating instances of extremism and communalism that mark the failures of both organized religion and Eurocentric secularism. For Majid, I quote, "No one can turn this place, Tangier, into Afghanistan. This is not some rugged wasteland. This is Tangier, Morocco. This is the legacy of Al-Andalus. Pleasure is encoded in our genes. We are almost Spanish." In this sense, both Tangier and Al-Andalus are highly celebrated as exemplars for multiculturalism, religious tolerance, and cultural hybridity. Through his novel, we infer that Majid calls the Arab Muslims to see Spain as a role model to follow because it invests in Al-Andalus and mixes this rich Islamic heritage with European modernity. In his unveiling traditions, post-colonial Islam in a polycentric world, Anouar Majid suggests that we need to, I quote, "question the representation of Islam and Islamic identity in a post-colonial studies, and to suggest that progressive Islamic alternatives are necessary for the emergence of a new multicultural order based on dialogue, not hegemony. The progressive Islamic alternative Majid is calling for is clearly manifested in his novel Second Chance in Tangier, that is Al-Andalus, where Muslim scholars used an Islamic tradition called ijtihad, interpretation, exegesis, and built a wonderful human civilization in which Muslims were intellectually, economically, and militarily strong. To use Hassan Urid's words, an Andalus must be revived as an idea, and this is what Majid is trying to say in his latest novel, Second Chance in Tangier. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Amrani. I think you used more time than is allotted to you, but we enjoyed your presentation so much that we gave you a grace period. Just a couple of things that I would like to kind of share with you and the rest of the audience. I'm really glad that you mentioned Corner West. And I think that Anouar Majid fits the bill, according to Corner West, who really called for what is called the organic catalyst. And that means that you should be trained in the canon and get your canon straight. And I'm glad that when you read a second Tangiers, you feel that you have somebody who really got to grip with the canons. Or the canons, I said, French, English, German, etc. And then they build, of course, their own sort of orientation. The second thing is, you talked about post-secular literature. I would say that in these times, we live in the post-secular state, which means that it's a state where you don't actually separate religion from the state, but you allow room for religion. That's exactly what the post-secular state. And I have a friend and a colleague, Muhammad Tozi, who used to say, religion did not disappear. It just redeployed itself. Yeah. And you talked about dialogue. I have to say that now we should be talking about pluri-dialogue. I think we're beyond the stage of dialogue. In the same way, we're beyond the stage of universalism, but we're examining the possibility of considering pluriversalism as opposed to universalism. Without further ado, again, I'd like to give the floor this time around to Mohammed Jalid, Moroccan journalist, researcher, translator, and university professor, and from Beni Mellal, Morocco. I'm reading.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Mr. Khalid Amin for inviting me once again to speak in this university. Before I start, I want to make a statement to Anouar Majid. I think thanks to these novels, you belong to a long literary tradition and a genealogy of writers whose interest is Tangier, like Shukri, Armin Jalloun, Burroughs, Matthias Enar, and others. This paper will focus on Majid's first novel, Yusuf. This novel is about 12 days meetings between the novel's protagonist, Mr. Yusuf, a long experienced senior from Tangier, and Lamine, a young student who just came back from Fez University to spend a short vacation in his hometown. Their meetings take place in Ashab's cafe. Si Yusuf is a shrewd and wise old man. Lamin is an ambitious man, irresistibly aspiring to write a literary work. I think it's a biography. Si Yusuf recounts orphan childhood in which he was forced to be responsible for his mother's and sister's support. His marriage to Senora Lucia, a legendary beauty from Spain, is a pivotal episode to his tale because it provokes several absurd stereotypes, criticism, and even mockery among Najma Cafe habitués, who openly blame his union with a Christian woman who will undoubtedly leave him one day and go back home. To avoid such unwanted comment and unbearable intrusions, Si Yusuf moves to Ashab's cafe, which he kept frequenting until he died. His memory and unconsciousness left several gaps of the past untold, for which Lamin has to provide the fullest extent. Si Yusuf's voice becomes a voice of Tangier, even of the whole Morocco, whose weakest man has the passion of 8 Europeans, as the novel's last sentence says. Si Yusuf's tale may seem ordinary. However, it's important insofar as it sheds light on Majid's whole intellectual project, though it's not an autobiography. The major characters reflect essential composite entities and an existential philosophy that proceeds from the nature, attitude, and mentality of the Tangier's people. They also highlight an open worldview and a direct interaction between the self, the other, and the surrounding. Tangier is the central focus of Greek, Mediterranean, African, and Islamic mythologies. Artistically speaking, the tale is well plotted and smoothly narrated. It clearly presents the event and characters and precisely defines the time-space relations. Dialogues are accurately inserted. The real and the fictional are successfully combined. The memory, whether related to history or to people and places, is well employed. Most importantly, the unique character of Tangier people is perfectly described, and the local dialect, namely anecdotes and proverbs, are accurately translated into English. The novel does not only seek to recount the life trajectory and ideas of an ordinary man from Tangier, nor does it merely envisage to show the techniques of a complex narration whose sole goal is to highlight a practical application of some theoretical shift within literary writing. Such a supposal is, of course, implicitly included within Majid's novels and should be uncovered separately. More than that, through this ordinary and common man, the novel celebrates a free, humanistic free will within a very large city and undergoing constant transformation. Tangier is depicted as any other border and coastal city that comes into contact with the near and far surroundings, that is, with the Mediterranean and European space and even overseas. The novel also calls to mind the Greek and Roman mythologies, historical interactions, notable personalities. It is also seen as a peaceful haven for ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity a city for humanism and freedom. Tangier is not only a transit or a destination for rest and tourism, it is even a suitable place for stay. Tangier is therefore conceived as a timeless, transcendental city that is preordained to withstand the wars of mythical heroes, gladiators, invaders coming from the four corners of the world. Later, Tangier will be a safe refuge for those fleeing inquisitions in Spain, African conflicts and famines, and most importantly, the global war of a teeny, I'm quoting, of a teeny little man with a funny mustache who had terrorized the world. Since a short time ago, probably when Sirius was born, it has become a favorable place for spies and red political lines, and a flourishing setting for luxuriant hotels, nightclubs, casinos, etc. A free zone, as the narrator puts it. It is depicted as an area outside the logic of our lives, where man drifted in and out with the same mystery that condemned to the life of peripheries and edges for reasons that were too complex for any of us to understand. The novel's description of humanistic dimensions of Tangier is also incarnated through characters. Though a religious man who overtly and triumphantly takes sides with Islam, C. Yusuf kept acting like a defender of human values and a supporter of belonging to a cosmic universalism. He got married to a Christian Spaniard. His religiousness served rather as a motive to adhere to his marriage, to remain faithful to Lucia, to recognize even that she had made his life better and easier, and reject his compatriots' continuous demands to break away from her. In reference to this, he says, "I divorced history to stay with my wife." History is here in reference to Nejma Cafe. In addition, C. Yusuf adopts a mystic trend, a kind of tolerant spiritual experience that is interested in knowing the nature of reality, existence, and metaphysics, open to other religions and beliefs, capable of dialoguing with other cultures and civilizations, but totally resistant to wars, fanaticism, atheism, etc. C. Yusuf enjoys the pleasures of living and working, but aspires also to reach eternal salvation. Such a doctrine is drawn from meditations on life and destiny, which result in the fact that man can not only find salvation in the surrounding, but also in distance. C. Yusuf longs to teaching this doctrine in schools and universities, instead of teaching history of wars, epidemics, famines, and crises of nations. Such a doctrine states that Islam is a humanistic horizon and a cosmic culture that concerns the whole world, because it contains no social hierarchies like the aristocracy. It is based, moreover, on joys and pleasures, as already said. C. Yusuf says, "My life acquired a new meaning. I was in love, and I was making enough money to support my wife and my mother. We traveled to neighboring towns, to Azila, to Tetuan, to Larash. We crossed the straits to Spain." The representation of the other is another humanistic configuration within C. Yusuf. The other, namely the European, is depicted in two ways. On the one hand, the novel celebrates a positive alterity, the marriage to Lucia, the ideal friendship of her father, the active engagement of his employer, Southern, are only few examples of such positive depiction. On the other hand, tense relations and negative images and visions are highlighted. The binary oppositions of superior, civilized, whites. I'm using kind of reservation here. I said the binary oppositions of superior, civilized whites versus backward, evil blacks are also presented, but in a critical way. Such a position is manifested through C. Yusuf's attitude towards a fascist, Juan Diaz, who described our country as a circus without a tent and believed that Moroccans were a bunch of retarded peasants ossified by tradition and lacked the average components of an evolved human species. Within the same scope of negative conflictual perception of the other lies the narrator's casual reference to burqa, stereotype that denotes Spanish people who had never been able to conceive of a better architecture than the one we had given them. Finally, the invocation of humanism is articulated through the opposition between the Moroccan Islamic and Western civilizations, the intersections of local and global dimensions of Tangier, and the implicit criticism of clash of civilizations. In page 112, Lamin describes Yusuf as a person divided between his absolute loyalty to the woman he loved and his pride for the culture that made him. He presents his critical judgment about the brutal and unannounced clash of culture that distorted the modern reasoning and logic of things, pushed many peoples to deadly wars, displaced many citizens, and left them homeless or suspended in no man's land. C. Yusuf also believes that the new colonialism is no different from the old one. He says, Spaniards were just as driven as we are, and besides, didn't we stay in Spain for centuries? By this, he shares the narrator's previous statement about intellectual impartiality and integrity towards history events. However, such a critical view of the world does not prevent Yusuf from celebrating Christmas and New Year with Lucia, unlike Lamin, who kept considering such feasts a holiday from school and a time for playing football. In time, like C. Yusuf, he will find out that there is nothing wrong if we are Europeanized or Americanized, up to a point. For wasn't the West also Orientalized? Their historians say that for ages that they had borrowed our skills and knowledge. So what's wrong? To conclude, Yusuf is not just a biographical story or a fictional narrative that sheds light on a marginal wise figure in the Moroccan society and a person with different lifestyle, views, and stands very positive in general, mainly towards the Nasara. Rather, it is a thorough creative work that reveals humanist aspects and qualities of a citizen and a nation that believes that the world should be cosmopolitan and should hold global values. In fact, C. Yusuf reflects a universal identity in which local and global values and cultures go well together. Tangier is the perfect place to live such values with regard to its historical and humanist evolution and cultural diversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Si Mohammed Jalid. Indeed, Tangiers presents a showcase of liminality. It's this space betwixt and between, and I'm here quoting a friend of Si Khalid from NYU, Richard Schechner, and I'll be quoting from Anouar Majid's A Second Chance in Tangiers, where he describes Tangiers. She stayed like an illegal immigrant in limbo, waiting for new directions that have yet to come. I think this presence in a limbo gives you a sense of freedom and liberty, and that liberty is carnivalesque. Right. Thank you. Now we're going to move on to a presentation in Arabic of a friend of Si Anouar Majid, Si Aziz Jadir. مرحبا بك. واش بغيتي تبقى هنا ولا تمشي للمنصة؟ اللي بغيتي. تمشي للمنصة داكوغ. تفضل.
لابد أن نشكر السي خالد الماسترو ديال هادشي كله. في البداية الكل ركز على سكند شانس ان تنجير، إذا الفرصة ثانية في طنجة. غالب هي شيء يشبه قضية الواد مع البحر. الواد باش يبقى مخلص لراسو تيصب البحر وتيرجع لبلادو، هي هذه القضية فيها الدورة هذه. اللي غتسمعوا هنا في الغالب هو نصوص او مقاطع من هذا النص السلامين. فرصة ثانية في طنجة بالعربية، هذا هو ربما اللي غيكون شبه مهم إذا كان شي حاجة مهمة هنا. ذات مرة اعترض جون بول سارتر صحفي وسأله هل بالإمكان تعريف الوجودية في كلمات محدودة؟ وطبعا فكر السي سارتر قال هي فلسفة إنسانية تضع الحرية فوق كل شيء. أنا فكرت في هذه القضية كيف يمكن تحديد عمل السي أنوار في جمل محدودة، وربما هذه الجمل هي اللي نحاول نشوفها من خلال فرصة ثانية في طنجة. إذن لذلك سأقرأ حتى لا أتأخر كثيرا. لتعريف عمل أنور بإيجاز يمكن القول إنه جهد تنويري تحريري، أداته النقد وحرية التفكير، ويتجلى ذلك من خلال الحوار مع الداخل العالم العربي والإسلامي والخارج مع الغرب عامة بقارته العجوز والقارة الجديدة، والصدام بين القطبين لتصحيح الرؤى وإعادة صياغة الأسئلة وزحزحة القناعات لتحريك السواكن. ستحاول هذه الكلمات أن تبين بعضا من هذا إن لم تخذلها سذاجة صاحبها من خلال بعض عناصر رواية فرصة ثانية في طنجة عبر تعاليق مترنحة كانت تصدر عن شخص ينضل وينتقل من فوق ظهر ديك رومي إلى ظهر جحش ملون. والنص إذن العودة الثانية إلى طنجة، فرصة ثانية في طنجة، رواية ذلك ما قال به رفيق في حديثه إلى أمين، وقد اتفقا ساعة اللقاء اليومي بينهما طبعا كما في النص. وسأل الأمين بن صديقه عن مخطط العمل فقال استشهد لن يتخذ العمل شكل سيرتك الذاتية، صفحة 189، ولو أنها تتخذ طبعا الرواية شكل رواية تعليمية فيما يبدو ما يشبه رواية بودنبروك لتوماس مان، أو شكل رواية فلسفية بشكل أوضح. لماذا؟ لأن المثار فيها وكما أشار الجميع القضية هناك بعد فكري المتجلي في هذا النص. هناك علاقة قوية بين ما كتبه أنوار مجيد في السابق في الفكر وفيما كتبه في الرواية السابقة سي يوسف، وهذه الرواية السلامين ولو أن اسمها فرصة ثانية في طنجة. في اسم الشخصيات كيف تجلى نفس التنوير من خلال اسماء لامين المجريطي، والمجريطي نسبة إلى في الغالب مسلمة المجريطي، والمجريطي هو المدريدي، مجريط هي اسم مدريد القديم، ومسلم المجريطي هذا عالم فلك ورياضيات عاش في مدريد طبعا ما بين 1950 و 1007، أي القرن العاشر والحادي عشر. وكان أسس مدرسة في هذين العلمين التنجيم والرياضيات. وعمله الأساس، وربما لهذا اختاره الكاتب، عمله الأساس مسلم المجريطي هو أنه حرر علم الفلك والتنجيم القائم على التوهم باعتماد الحساب والمشاهدة والتجربة، أي أشياء ملموسة وليس الخرافة. وعمل أنوار في الغالب هو هذا التنوير، أي محاربة أشكال الخرافة أو القبول أي شيء. من خلال الشخصيات والفضاءات أيضا نجد هذا التقابل بين الهنا والهناك، بين هنا والغرب، هنا وأمريكا عامة، من خلال الشخصيات إلى آخره. ولكن سأختار، أو حاولت أن أختار حتى لا أطيل، شخصيتين تمارسان مهنة الإشفاء، طبعا الطبيب والفقيه، وكما يسميه النص فقيه، حتى التسمية هي التسمية بالعربية فقيه وليس فقيه. لما أصيب الأمين بداء الربو عرض على طبيب، وهو يعتمد، طبعا الطبيب يعتمد في التماس الشفاء الحبوب والحقن، ثم اقترح عليه بخاخة، وبعد ذلك تخلى عنها الأمين في صغره عندما بعد نصيحة من صيدلية خشية أن يتحول ذلك إلى إدمان مدى الحياة. ويلاحظ أن حضور الطبيب لا يتجاوز في النص، في عودة فرصة ثانية لطنجة، الصفحة الواحدة، بينما حضر الفقيه في صفحات كثيرة جدا. ويبدو هذا الحضور من خلال وصف السارد له: استشهد: جلست أمام شيخ ذي لحية بيضاء منسدلة يرتدي جلابة عفوا وليس جلبابا لأن هو يحتفظ بالاسم المغربي، يرتدي جلابة رمادية اللون. سألني: أين الألم؟ هنا أشرت إلى صدري. غمغم بعض كلمات وسكب بعض الماء في المحبرة وبدأ يمزج بينهما. غمس القلم في المحبرة وأخذ قطعة من الورق وبدأ يكتب. انتهى الاستشهاد. أيكون الفقيه فتح باب الحرف وصناعته وقدرة الحرف على الشفاء من الألم وتغيير الأحوال أمام السارد الذي سيدرك سر الكلمة وقوتها؟ أيكون ذلك الحدث وراء زرع بذور الكتابة في قلب السلامين ودورها التنويري هو الذي سيمتشق القلم فيما بعد لممارسة التنوير؟ في هذه الرواية إذن من الخصائص التي تتميز بها، وقد تمت الإشارة إلى أنها رواية أقرب إلى الرواية الفلسفية وليس فقط السيرة الذاتية. نقرأ ما يلي. والفلسفة طبعا هي نشاط عقلاني وهو مدار التنوير أساسا. اقرأ ما ورد في النص: إن الحديث عن الرأي العام يذكرني باستبداد الأغلبية وطغيانها. بمعنى من المعاني فإن الديمقراطيات من النوع الأمريكي، والكل أشار إلى النقد طبعا الأمريكا، فإن الديمقراطيات من النوع الأمريكي تختزل الناس في أدنى قاسم إنساني مشترك من أجل تحقيق مجتمع فعال يؤدي وظائفه. وينتهي: بك الأمر أن تقضي العمر بين أمة من المواطنين الملتزمين بقبول القانون وملايين السجناء يعيشون جميعا تحت رحمة قانون انتقامي. يسود العنف الجارف في كل مكان، وهذا واقع الحال وهو أحد أسباب عودتي إلى هنا. انتهى الاستشهاد يكمله من: بقينا ملتزمين، طبعا يوسف ورفيق. الصمت لمدة دقيقة كاملة قبل أن يعود الأمين إلى الحديث مرة أخرى. وكما تعلم الحديث له، فقد ذكرني حديثك عن الأغلبيات بطوكفيل، طبعا صاحب الدولة الديمقراطية، بطوكفيل الذي أبدى درجة كبيرة من الإعجاب بأمريكا مثله في ذلك مثل كريفور، لكنه أصيب بالفزع من شبح حكم الأغلبية التي تمارس طغيانا عنيفا وطافحا في مواجهة المواطنين وتعاقب بشدة بشكل أساسي الاختلاف. نعم، الديمقراطية الأمريكية في نهاية المطاف تنتج حياة متواضعة تواضعا مخيفا لا يستطيع الفرنسي أن يتحملها. لقد تمنى ديمقراطية تم تطهيرها من فخاخها الأمريكية والمزالق. ما يعتبر أمرا مدهشا بالنسبة لي هو أن توكفيل كان قادرا على انتقاد أمريكا بعد بضع سنوات فقط، بينما بالنسبة لي تظل أمريكا دائما تتقدم بخطوتين، مما يجعل من الصعب اللحاق بها. طبعا كان السارد هنا يبين أنه لم ينتبه لما ورد من المجتمع الأمريكي أو صيغة المجتمع الأمريكي، ولذلك يستشهد بالملاحظة الذكية للمرأة التي تم الاستشهاد بها هنا مرات، أنها قالت عن الأمريكيين أنهم ملقطين. وطبعا هو الإشارة كان السارد لم يدرك هذا الأمر في السابق. توقف للحظة، ما زال الاستشهاد من الصفحة 43، ثم سأل: هل تعلم أن توكفيل تنبأ أيضا بأنه لا يمكن تطبيق الديمقراطية في المجتمعات الإسلامية التي يحكمها القرآن؟ أقال بذلك؟ نعم، بل إنه تنبأ أيضا أن لا فرصة للإسلام ولا حظ له في العصر الحديث أن ينشأ بين أحضان مجتمعاته الديمقراطية والقيم التنويرية. ابتسمت وأضاف: هذا موضوع أجل الخوض فيه من وقت لآخر. لماذا؟ لأن هو موضوع صعب مناقشته، ولو سيعود إليه من بعد. ويبين أن ربما الديانات تفرض نوع من التنميط، والتنميط يحيل أو يحول دون النقد، ممارسة النقد، وهو الفعل الذي أشرت في البداية أنه تشير إليه الرواية وتركز عليه كثيرا. ثم يرد في الرواية طبعا فرصة ثانية في طنجة هذا البعد الانسيكلوبيدي الذي يبين أن وراء الكتابة، وهو ما أشار إليه السيمونات، كيف نصب الفكر في العمل التخيلي. يبدو هذا العمل واحد من أمثلة كثيرة، هو ما قيل عن الدم. الدم في النص يمثل بعدا انسيكلوبيديا كبيرا جدا، لأنه يتناول تاريخ الدم منذ اكتشاف أهميته، محاولة المحافظة عليه، كيف يمكن أن ينقل أو لا ينقل من الحيوان، التجارب الأولى إلى غيره. هي تجارب ربما كانت حتى جنونية كما يشير النص، ولكن أن هذا تاريخ الدم، والدم سيصبح هو أهم شيء في تاريخ البشرية، وهو الذي يعطي الحياة بعد الولادة. يشمل بعد التنوير في الرواية هذا الإبحار في تاريخ الدم، كل تاريخ الدم، والجهود الكونية التي تمتد من التفكير في الحفاظ على الحياة والأرواح إلى الاحتفاظ به، ثم نقله من شخص آخر ومن مكان آخر. أستشهد بما ورد في الرواية: ذكر الدم مئات المرات في الكتاب المقدس، ولكن لولا وجود المفكرين الأحرار أصحاب العقول المبدعة كنا سنظل نعيش في العصور المظلمة ونقاتل ونموت دون داع. مات الناس من أجل الدم، وهو ما نعرفه الآن. وإني، طبعا السارد يتحدث عن التجربة التي عاشها، وإني مدين بحياة ابني لقائمة طويلة من الأطباء المنسيين وهم مجانين بما يكفي للتفكير في نقل الدم، ولكننا واكتشاف الفصيلة الواحدة وهو ما لم تكن لنا عنه أدنى فكرة، ثم اكتشاف أنواع الدم ومضادات التخثر لجمع وتخزين الدم وحقن الأشخاص به عبر الحقن. يقول هو الذي قضى أشهرا، طبعا السارد انتهى الاستشهاد، يقول هو الذي قضى عدة أشهر يقاسم ابنه الغرفة المستشفى، استشهاد الآن، للمرة الأولى في حياتي تمكنت من رؤية الدم بشكل مختلف، ليس كعلامة على الجرح أو الإصابة أو المذابح، ولكن كقوة مانحة للحياة، مما سمح لابني أن يستعيد حياته ويبقى على قيد الحياة. فكرت في سفر التكوين وتأكيده على علاقات الدم وعلم الأنساب، وأدركت كيف كان هذا المفهوم بدائيا قويا ولكنه قبلي إلى أقصى الحدود، لأن الناس لم يعرفوا ما سيعرفونه لاحقا، وهو أن الدم تراث مشترك مثل النهر يتدفق عبر عروق البشر. أما يجدر بها كل العلماء، أما يجدر بهؤلاء أن تقام لهم نصب، لأن أكبر اكتشاف الذي طور الحياة والصحة هو اكتشاف الدم. وطبعا الدم يتردد في النص بشكل كبير، يتردد حين يسكب بظلم مع موت عزيز لما أطلق عليه الشرطي الرصاص بدون أن يكون ارتكب إثما. يذكر في الأنساب ويذكر في التأمل السارد في علاقته مع الأبناء، ثم العلاقة في الحب مع الزوجة، هؤلاء من الصلب من الدم وهي ليست كذلك إلى آخره. ويصبح موضوع الدم في هذا البعد الانسيكلوبيدي المعرفي في النص تيمة خاصة كانت تشكل رواية مستقرة بذاتها أو قائمة بذاتها. في جانب الكتابة تمت الإشارة في البداية إلى الفقيه، والفقيه طبعا كان هو الذي زرع البذرة الأولى في نفس رفيق ليكتب. لماذا؟ لأنه لما كتب وشفي من تلك الكتابة بدا أن للحجاب وللكلمة قوة. تمت الإشارة من قبل الفقيه الذي لفت انتباه الأمين إلى سحر الحرف وقوة الكلمة وقدرتها على تغيير كل شيء وتنوير العقول. ثم إذن الآن استشهاد فيما يخص الكتابة، ثم فتح له الجزل الذي شارك في الحرب العالمية الثانية السبيل إلى عالم فوركنر وغابرييل غارسيا ماركيز، فأخذت حياته منعطفا آخر. اندلعت لغة الحلم في الجنوب من كتاباتهما وشلته على الفور من شدة الوقع، مما جعل يشعر أنه عاد إلى طنجة وعاد إلى بوخشخاش، وبوخشخاش هو المكان الذي يوجد به الفقيه والذي يبدو كأنه علم السارد رفيق الكتابة، وعاد إلى بوخشخاش، وأن كتابة الأدب ليست مجرد عمل جمالي ولكن شكل حيوي لإعادة كتابة وترميز تاريخ شعب معين. كان مفتونا بعائلة بوندية في 100 عام من العزلة، وأوضح لمين أن الأمر لا يقف عند هذا الحد فقط بل يتجاوزه إلى الجمل التي يفتتح بها النص، يفتتح بها هذا الكاتب روايته. هي رواية من ذهب خالص، فقط يجب أن يفكر في الأمر. هنا رجل يواجه فرقة الإعدام وبما يفكر بعد ظاهرة يوم بعيد عندما أخذ والده لاكتشاف الجليد. إذا أمام فريق الإعدام هو يفكر في اليوم الجليد. مدهش هذا الأمر. يمكن للمرء أن يدفع ثمن الكتاب كله من أجل تلك الجملة، فقط لم أنسها قط. قد أعطتني القوة في الأوقات الصعبة. يحدث شيء من هذا القبيل في بداية رواية الحب في زمن الكوليرا، حيث ربط أوربينو بين رائحة اللوز المر ومصير الحب غير المتبادل. إذا احتجت يوما إلى توضيح إلى توضيح أمجاد الأدب لا يمكنني التفكير في مثل هذا المثل. طبعا كل هذا يبين كيف للأدب وحين تعاد صياغته في فرصة ثانية في طنجة أن يحدث الفرق، أن يحدث التغيير ويسهم في التنوير أيضا. وكتابة ماركيز وفولكنر إلى آخره كما ترد في النص تؤكد هذا. ثم هذا التأمل أو النقد للمجتمع الأمريكي، وبه تقريبا أختم، أنه جعل من أمريكا كما يرد في النص علامة تجارية ولا عواطف. يسترجع رفيق قبيل نهاية الرواية حديثه المضمخ بالخيبة ويرى أن أمريكا لم تعد أمريكا، لأن تمثال الحرية بجزيرة إليس لم يعد يرحب بالمهاجرين، أولئك الذين يريدون الحصول على سبل للكسب ومكان للعيش وطعام على المائدة والوظائف التي يجب الحصول عليها. رده: أنت على حق، كان المجيء إلى أمريكا بالنسبة لي صفقة كبيرة. شعرت أني كنت متجها إلى كوكب مختلف عندما نزلت طبعا مطار جون فيتزجيرالد كينيدي. كان هناك شعور يعد بالفرصة، فرصة ثانية وربما حتى فرصة ثالثة. طبعا هذا كان هناك، لم يعد لها نفس المعنى. تمكن المبتكرون في وادي السيليكون وهوليود من تحويل بلادهم إلى علامة تجارية عادية، بل تجربة مخيفة، وتغيير تطبيق مجتمعهم عن طريق التطبيق، وهوية تلو الأخرى، وبلد يبحث عن المكافآت والمحامين الذين يسعون للحصول على تعويضات، والأشخاص غير القادرين على العمل على التعامل مع الضغط، وأمة الأيتام والعاطفيون والناس غير العاقلين، لا عواطف حقيقية، لا تواصل ولا لمسات ولا لطف حقيقيين. لذلك ترد في النص مرات رأفة بالأجنبي pity of stranger. والخيبة تبلل سيل التنوير، تزرع بذور الانكسار، خاصة بالنسبة لشاب حل ببلد العمصام حاملا معه آمال عريضة وضمائر لا يرتوي للمعرفة والنور والحرية وكل ما يحمل به الدستور الأمريكي نظريا. لذلك يقول سيلامين بعد أن أشار إلى المتع الجمال التي جناها من حدائق فولكنر وماركيز وجوزيف كونراد، دون أن ينسى أن يتساءل عما إذا كان سيعرف مصيره ذاته. طبعا الأجنبي الذي يكتب بلغة أجنبية هي الإنجليزية بالنسبة لكونراد. يقول سيلامين سيشهد النص: واصلت الغوص بشكل أعمق وأعمق في العالم السفلي من الملذات العلمانية وما استطعت التوقف. تضاعفت لقاءاته الغريبة، لقد كنت مرهقا ولكن لا أشبع، حيث عوضت أجيالا من المغاربة الذين لم تتح لهم الفرصة. كما تعلمون الأشخاص الذين تراهم هنا أذكياء مبدعون ولطيفون، ولكنهم غير قادرين على عيش إنسانيتهم بالكامل، ولا يعرفون أين يلتقون بها. وعلقت قائلا حسنا السلامين: الناس في عمري موزقون حرفيا بين إمكانياتهم وما هو ممكن فعله. أنا معجب دائما بقدرتهم على استخدام أحدث الأجهزة الإلكترونية، كأنهم بهذا المعنى يعيشون في وادي السيليكون أو شنغهاي. وعلى سبيل الختم، طبعا يرد في النص هذا الاستشهاد: كانت شمس فترة ما بعد الظاهرة من شهر يناير باردة بما يكفي، ولكنها ليست باردة. كانت الأرصفة أقل ازدحاما في هذه الساعة، وصارت السيارات بهدوء لدرجة أني نسيت تقريبا أني كنت في طنجة. طلبت قهوة نسبريسو وجلست فقط، لا أنظر إلى هاتفي ولا أتحدث إلى أي شخص. كنت بحاجة إلى تجميع أفكاري، وربما أنا أيضا في راهن جمع الأفكار، ولكن فقط الآن أذكر من الكلمات التي قيلت أن هناك نوع من الإطراء على ما كتبه أو ما جاء في الرواية عامة، وهذا الصدق الفني الذي فيها. يهمني أمران: أن في الرواية عامة حاول الكاتب أن يحرر صورة طنجة النمطية التي زرعها الأدباء الأجانب في معظمهم عامة. لماذا؟ لأن الأجنبي دائما يبقى أجنبي ولا تعاطف له مع أبناء أي بلد. أنوار من هذا المنظور طبعا، أو رفيق من هذا المنظور، يتعاطف مع المدينة ومع البلد، ولذلك أعطى هذه الصورة التي تبدو صادقة. ثم ورد في هذا النص هذه العبارة ربما تؤكد ما قيل الآن، وهما يتحدثان. قال له write your feelings رفيق and don't worry about the rest, there is nothing else. إذن حين نكتب عواطفنا نكون صادقين ونصل إلى ما يبدو أنه يثير رونق الآخرين. وقبل أن نختم تنتهي الرواية بهذه العبارات. سيقول في الأخير: he had enough memories and imagination to keep him busy for 5 or 6 lifetimes. The problem was mine, really. What was I going to do now? I have finished writing my book. وربما نطرح سؤال للسنوار: ماذا سيفعل الآن؟
شكرا أستاذ عزيز. طبعا الرواية عندها طابع انطباعي، very impressionistic. وأنا سعيد لأن درنا هذه المداخلة باللغة العربية، لأنني كنتفق مع مفكر مغربي سي عبد الفتاح كيليطو، كيقول: أنا أتكلم جميع اللغات بالعربية. Je parle toutes les langues mais en arabe.
كنت الوحيد الذي تحدث العربية، وكان علي أن أسأل: لا يخرج من الجماعة إلا هذاك ولا هذاك، إلا إبليس أم الملك؟
طبعا من بين القطع أنا اللي يعني استمتعت بها في الرواية، وهي Blood of Nations، ودم الأوطان. حقيقة هذه القطعة في الرواية أنا شخصيا أثرت فيه بشكل كبير، لأن كتشوف واحد الوليد مريض، كيجي واحد يهودي كيعطي الدم، وهذاك اليهودي قرر لبناني مسلم الخوري، وتا هو كيجي كيدير واحد الدياغنوستيك للوليد، وكيجي المعلم الأستاذ ديالو تا هو كيعطي الدم. يعني حقيقة ربما يعني الدم هو الوطن. وهنا غادي نختم بشكسبير، لأنه هو الأول اللي هضر على خيانة الدم، the treason of blood، يعني في العلاقة ديال ديستمونا مع أوتيلو. فكي لا أطيل عليكم، الآن حان الوقت لنعطي الكلمة الأخيرة لأستاذنا الكريم أنور ماجد، فليتفضل مشكورا إلى المنصة. ونطلب منك تبقى في المنصة، لأن كاين واحد المفاجأة. مفاجأة. A pleasant surprise.
All right, so I will say I will speak in English mostly, but maybe I may speak in Darija at some point, depending on where my remarks will take me. So Aziz, I'll begin with the last speaker, Aziz Jadir. There are two Aziz on this panel, by the way. The first Aziz was deeply affected by the fate of Aziz in the novel. I don't know about this Aziz, but but the second Aziz, the novel would not have been written without him. So, as you know, I wrote a piece in Tangier magazine, and somebody thanked him for that. He'd been, you know, Aziz has been talking to me, interviewing me, translating my work into Arabic for more than 5 years. And so I remember very vividly how it happened. And he'd been after me. He's not the only one. There are others who've been saying the same thing, but he's been persistent that C. Yusuf was written a long time ago. I need to write another novel, and it wasn't in me. You know, I'm not a mechanical writer, so if I don't feel it, if I don't feel the urge, I don't have a schedule for writing. But he kept persisting and persisting. And one day, it was January 2019, maybe January 6th, I can't remember the exact date. We were walking in the marina of Tangier, and then I just to like, okay, say, you know, so I stopped, shook his hand, and said, I'm going to do it. So the novel would not have been written if it were not for Aziz. And Aziz, and in fact, somebody was asking me yesterday, Tony, about it. It has very strong autobiographical elements in it. And I think because that is the effect of Aziz. Aziz has spent more than 5 years. I think he's writing something, if I may say so, about my work in Arabic and everything else. And then he's been extracting this information from me bit by bit. Like, you know, he'd ask me a somewhat personal question, intimate. You know, we Moroccans tend to be a little shy. We are not open. We are not a therapeutic culture like we have in the United States. Not yet. And then he'd come back a year later and ask the same question in a different way. And then it slowly, very slowly, kept excavating and extracting a lot of information from me. And by the time I sat down to write this novel, it felt like an extension of that conversation. Like basically, I'd already opened up to Aziz in so many ways that and so I owe a lot to him for having first persisted in having me write another novel, which was not in the works for me, and for giving me this opportunity now to sit with you with this incredible panel of great thinkers. And you know, a journalist asked me a few minutes ago about this event, and I said, you know, it's just amazing. I am in the presence of these incredibly amazing university professors in Morocco. They're to think that Morocco has this caliber of professors and writers and critics. Teaching Moroccan students is, to me, an amazing gift that should be recognized and talked about in every time possible, because we have a very low opinion of higher education in Morocco, or education as a whole. And I think this exemplifies the high quality of Moroccan higher education. And I'm so very, because I work in administration, I've been in administration for a long time at UNE, we talk a lot about the future of higher education and what's wrong with higher education. But this is everything that's right with higher education, university life in Morocco, and I'm so grateful. It warms my heart. And to comment on all this, what you just said, all of you. I mean, a couple of things. You know, I liked what Mimon said about writing becomes a third geography. I mean, that's an interesting concept. I mean, it's like writing as geography. You know, yeah, that's enough. If we could speak volumes, you could probably do a lot with that. I'm looking forward to something like that, to reading anything that touches on that. The post-secular text. It's a very interesting notion. I mean, Tony yesterday, we were having a conversation, and people periodically would use the word mysticism in the context of my writing, or at least in the fiction. But you know, I hesitate to name things, you know, just because naming them changes the elusiveness of those things you're feeling. So I don't want to name them. Naming is a form of controlling. So I avoid naming things. So I let the aura emanate from whatever it is that's on the page, and people can make their own conclusions. And yeah, I divorced history to write, to marry a Christian. That's a very, that's a permanent tension. And in fact, I talk about King Hassan II's advice to his subjects in the book about what to do and not to do. Those are very, the section on blood, blood, yes, it fascinated me. I started reading medical literature, especially about blood, some time ago, especially after this is inspired by real life events. My son was diagnosed with AML, acute myeloid leukemia, at the age of 5. And I was hoping to write a whole novel something about, which became one chapter in the book, Blood of Nations. And then I realized that there's a huge amount, a lot to say about blood, beginning from the Bible, Genesis, and genealogies are related to blood and everything. There's blood everywhere. People are afraid of blood. There was a time when people were afraid of AIDS, which was related to blood transfusions. You remember blood transfusions and hemophiliacs getting AIDS and all that stuff. Blood is an incredible, powerful biological fact in our lives, but also cultural in so many ways. The book I had contemplated after my son's sickness was a history of blood, or a cultural history of blood, but it never came to be. And so we need memory workers. I love that. It's just great. We need memory workers. Think of that. We need people to think about what a memory means. Memory, people will remember. One thing I should say, I felt a little not jealous, or protective of one of my books. I like books that like children, maybe in some cases. I don't feel the same way, but there's a book that never somehow gets omitted in this event. It's Freedom and Orthodoxy. Have you had a chance to look at it? Anybody? It's Freedom and Orthodoxy. It's the book published in 2004 that looks at what happened, the impact of Western imperialism and colonialism on two separate peoples, Native Americans and Muslims. And so it is in that book, I wanted to title that book Post-Andalusianism, and therefore enlarge Edward Said's notion of Orientalism, because to me, like some of you said, the modern history begins, if you want to find one specific date to mark the beginning of modern history and what happens to non-Europeans, is 1492. But it is now it's the post-Andalusian condition is in the subtitle of the book, because the publisher told me at that time that post-Andalusianism does not exist as a word in the English language. So we negotiated something. It ended up being in the subtitle. It's a study that looks at how cultures can escape their histories. I chose the theories of Cornelius Castoriadis, the great Greek-French philosopher who wrote about the social imaginary. I wanted to see how can we ever escape our destinies and the ways we are now, and how difficult it is to do so, because even though we may feel like we are arguing among each other, like in the United States nowadays, Democrats and Republicans and leftists and people on the right, but they all drink from the same culture, which is the American culture. That is what shapes and forms all of their behaviors and attitudes and so on. So even though they may be disagreeing on petty political issues, they all are part of the same cultural tradition. And how does one begin to escape that tradition seems to be like a Herculean task. So I'm not so sure I'm surprising you now, but I'm very grateful. This has been a momentous event for me, very personal. I have really no words to thank all of you for the panelists, the kindness of Khalid Amin, who organized this event, and for what he's trying to do, for Aziz for encouraging me to write another novel, and for all of you, Anas and everybody else, the quality of the criticism, the the reflections, the analyses. It just makes my work worth it. And maybe I'll continue on the same path in the next few years. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I spoke to Khalid about me reading a poem, not by me, by Derek Walcott, a Nobel Prize winner, professor of poetry at the University of Essex, where Khalid and I did our masters. I'm going to read Derek Walcott. The poem is entitled Love After Love. And this is for Lamin, for Anwar, and for Rafiq. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit and feast on your life.